So, what is complex post-traumatic stress disorder? Complex post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as C-PTSD, is very similar, obviously, to PTSD, but is also very similar, or at least slightly similar to BPD as well. So, two quick disclaimers I want to make before I get into this video. Number one, this is not going to be a video on what it's like living with complex post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm not ready to make that video yet, and I figured before I made a video on what it's like living with CPTSD, I should make a video explaining what CPTSD actually is, because whilst the majority of people have heard of PTSD, most people have never heard of CPTSD. Common sense, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a therapist, anything. I'm just a young person that has a diagnosis of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's something that I wanted to talk about because I feel like it's very important to not just raise awareness on what CPT is and how to help people with it, but also for people with CPTSD to feel less alone, because it is very easy to feel alone when you have this diagnosis. But what is it? Well, like I said, it's similar to PTSD and BPD. So it contains all the classic well-known symptoms of PTSD, like hypervigilance, avoidance, flashbacks, nightmares, stuff like that. But it also contains extra symptoms that PTSD doesn't have, whereas things like BPD do. And they can be things like trouble controlling your emotions, trouble with dissociation, trouble forming and maintaining close relationships, and stuff like that. It can have a very, don't get me wrong, PTSD can have a very severe effect on your life, but the effect that complex PTSD will have on your life and your mind is 10 times that. And that's simply because, PTSD, 99.9% of the time, is caused by one single traumatic event, such as, maybe you were in a car accident, or maybe you got robbed one night walking home. And, whilst those events are certainly traumatic and will have an effect on you, for the most part, people, when they experience that and get PTSD, it's sort of like, right, this is who I was before I experienced this event. This is who I am now. However, I remember who I was before the event and I want to try and get back to that. But if you have complex PTSD, then chances are you have not experienced one single traumatic event. You have experienced years worth of traumatic events where the trauma was prolonged, inescapable, and most likely committed by somebody that was supposed to love you, take care of you, and somebody that you trusted. For the majority of people, this is things like boyfriends, girlfriends, parents, stuff like that. And complex PTSD can stem and become a thing from physical abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse. As I've already stated, I'm not going to be going too deep into my own experiences and what it's like for me living with it. I just want to make this video to explain what it is, and then in the future I'll make a video of, my own history, my own story, my own background as somebody with complex PTSD. But in this video, I just wanted to sort of come out and talk about what it is. People with complex PTSD will often suffer a very distorted sense of themselves, a very distorted and disturbed perception of themselves. So they may have thoughts like, I'm worthless, I'm nothing, I'm nobody, I should kill myself, the world would be a better place without me, I'm guilty, I'm broken, I'm damaged goods, nobody will ever love me, nobody will ever like me, nobody will ever take care of me. And, to people without complex PTSD, this might just sound like, oh, he's just miserable and negative, just leave him alone, I can't be arsed, do you get what I mean? But for people that have complex PTSD, people like me, or for anyone that's a doctor, a psychiatrist that's training and learning about complex PTSD, that these thoughts aren't just somebody trying to be miserable or having a bad day. These thoughts are thoughts that are literally embedded and engraved in the person because of the experience they have had leading up to this moment in time. And what makes living with CPTSD so difficult is that even though the trauma is over, whatever you were going through, you're not going through it now, the effect that it had on your body and your brain is still there. And this is why, flashbacks can be very difficult. So as for me, I'm a survivor of domestic violence, domestic abuse from parents and ex-partners. So for me, things like plate smashing, cupboard slamming, shouting, screaming, fighting, they can set me off and trigger flashbacks, association and stuff like that. And if you have complex PTSD, you're more likely to suffer an emotional flashback than you are like a visual one. So what I mean by that is, you know, for people with PTSD, right, say you were in a car crash, sometimes you can have flashbacks, you know, especially nightmares as well, where it's like you are reliving that moment in time again. Because, you know, there's one single event, you can recall it and it can replay in your mind. Whereas if you have complex PTSD, there's a pretty big chance you won't remember most of the trauma that happened to you because your brain blocks it out. Your brain does not process traumatic memories properly. They get stuck. And even if you do sort of remember it, there's just so much that if you were to experience a flashback, you're more likely to experience an emotional flashback than a visual one. If you have an emotional flashback, you know, you live with C-PTSD, it's not like you visually re-experience the moment again. At least not for me anyway. And obviously, it's important to remember everyone's experience with complex post-traumatic stress disorder is unique. However, for me, it's like, I'm not visually reliving the moment again, but all the feelings, thoughts, sensations, you know, in my mind and in my body that I had during those moments, during those traumatic events and memories, even though I'm not visually reliving it, you know, sensationally, you know, in my mind, in my body, I am. And what does that look like for me? Well, obviously I can dissociate, which is, you know, when you sort of just zone out. The best way I can describe it is like, your body is present, but your mind is not. It's like your body's there, you're stood there, but it's a shell. And then you, your actual consciousness, your mind, who you are, what makes you, you, is on an entirely different planet somewhere. And then, you know, if I don't dissociate, I can panic. So, you know, anxiety, tapping, shaking, I feel very in danger. And it doesn't matter if you're a friend, a family member, it doesn't matter how long I've known you, it doesn't matter if I don't know you. Like, if I'm triggered and I'm set off and I'm genuinely worried about my safety, which is a very key thing in complex PTSD, a lot of us have never felt safe, and a lot of us will never truly feel 100% safe, although there's treatment available. You know, like, I do trauma-based cognitive behavioural therapy, but if that doesn't work for you, EDMR is out there too. You know, there's different types of treatments and therapies for complex PTSD. However, cognitive behavioural therapy, trauma-based cognitive behavioural therapy has worked quite well for me so far. Although I'm nowhere near finishing my treatment, it's basically just began. So, it's a fairly new diagnosis. I think I might have spoken about this already, but I'm not sure. It's not in the DSM-5 yet. However, it is in like the WHO's list of like conditions and shit. So, when I say that, I don't mean it's impossible to get a diagnosis. Of course it is, you know. There's loads of people out there with a diagnosis of complex PTSD, me included. It's just, if you work with a mental health community or team or person that bases a lot of this stuff off of the DSM-5, you may be misdiagnosed or not diagnosed at all, because it's not in the DSM-5. Some people don't like to diagnose it. However, that doesn't mean that it isn't an official diagnosis. It is. It's just not in the DSM-5. So, but that pretty much does it. So, like I said, complex PTSD, similar to PTSD and BPD, although a lot more severe than PTSD, you know, stems from prolonged childhood. It doesn't always have to be in your childhood, but 9 times out of 10 it usually is. It's a change in the state of the brain and the body that stems from years of prolonged, inescapable, emotional, physical, psychological, or sexual trauma and abuse. And, you know, like, it can cause memory loss, it can cause difficulties with relationships, sense of self, self-worth, all that type of stuff. But that's pretty much it. Like I said, you know, it's a fairly new diagnosis. There's not a lot of information out. And like I said, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm just somebody that lives with complex PTSD. So, you know, don't get me wrong, it's very important to hear out, you know, the cases, the stories and the histories, thoughts and feelings of survivors. But it's also important you get your information from professionals as well, like psychiatrists and therapists, psychologists, etc., etc. So, that pretty much does it for this video on what complex PTSD is. Sorry if it wasn't that great or that interesting, but I'm not really ready to talk about what it's like living with it just yet. I thought I'd just come out and explain what it is. But I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, please like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one. This is Toshi, signing out.